good to see you all here this morning. I want to get us started off with a little bit of exercise. Now, I know that word can be kind of frightening because, let's face it, exercise can be difficult. I'm making this up, but I think that's part of the root word for exercise. It means hard, and then we don't like to do it. Anyway, this exercise will be easier than what we might picture. It's an exercise of our imagination, a mental exercise. And so if you could, I want you to imagine that you are hungry. Not that hard. If you're a teenager and you happen to be in here, I know that that reflects the truth already. You are hungry all of the time. At least that's my experience. Imagine that you're hungry. And I'm sorry that this might do this to you. It might actually make you hungry. But imagine that you feel this way. And then imagine after the service, someone has promised to take you out for pizza. Your favorite pizza. Pepperoni, sausage, banana peppers, ooey gooey, melty cheese, perfect crust, all of it. They have promised not only to take you, but to purchase the pizza for you. So after the service, your preferred pizza partner comes promising to purchase pepperoni pie. I had to write that one down. It's a whole lot of peas, and so I didn't want to mess them up. But that's the promise that awaits you. Pepperoni pizza from the Pizza Palace. Now, the Pizza Palace is made up, and that's an actual palace. I just, put pizza in front of it. But the Pizza Palace is made up because I don't want us to get into arguments over what's better, Domino's or Papa John's or Little Caesars or Carmine's or Joey-O's or Geno's or wherever you like to eat your pie. I like all of those. I'm not particular with my pizza pie. Lots of peas still happening. Anyway, it doesn't matter where you're picturing right now, but you know that Pizza Palace is coming before you. And so after service, you either get in the car with the person or you meet them at your preferred place, and you get into your Pontiac to go to your pizza. See, you hear them. If I'm not careful, they'll be all throughout this thing. But you're getting your pizza afterwards, and then you get in the vehicle and you notice, man, we've gone to the right. And Pizza Palace is over here to the left. What's happening? I'm not quite sure what's going on. And then they pull into the bank and you think, inflation. They need to gather a little extra cash to pay for my pizza party. And so you're like, okay, I get this one. Maybe they'll purchase me a pop to go along with it. You get it. But then they pull out of the bank and they still go to the right again, and Pizza Palace is still over here to the left, and you think, man, this is weird. And then they pull into the post office. I didn't have this one down in the last service, but Pastor Schrum told me I should have added, to pick up their political propaganda. But they pull into the post office, and you're like, that's weird. It's Sunday. They have a P.O. box. It's fine. They're getting their parcels from their post office. And then they pull out of the post office, and they're going to the right. And all of a sudden, the trip that you thought was to the Pizza Palace starts to do one of these numbers. You're kind of going all over the place. You stop at your mother-in-law's house. You stop at the store. You see somebody along the street. You share with them the stories about your days in the past. You stop in here and there and the other place, and then you begin to wonder, well, how long will it actually be until the promised pizza arrives? How long is it before you start to grumble and question if that promise will ever be delivered in the first place? We can be tempted to question the promise. Will it happen? Will we get there? Are we headed in that direction at all? I mean, we've been doing this. Pizza Palace is over here somewhere. We can question the path, the direction that we've been taking. We can feel like they might have gone astray with that. And we can question the provision, if we will be provided for along the way. If we're anything like the Israelites, which I fear that more often than not we can be, or at least we can be tempted to be like them at times, we can do these very things. We've been in this season where we're working through the story of God, kind of going in a chronological way, hearing the story of our awesome Lord. And one of the things that we heard from God is how he promised to a people that they were chosen, set us apart to be holy, a nation dedicated unto him, that they were the descendants of Abraham, and that God had a purpose for them, not only to provide salvation for them, but for the world, that all who might believe and come through that promise would be saved. And so we hear the story of these people through Abraham, and we follow their journey through Isaac and Jacob, and we hear about Joseph and how he goes to Egypt, and how his path gets a little windy, a little challenging, a little difficult, to say the least. But that promise remains. God speaking to Abraham, I'll make a covenant with you. Your descendants will be more numerous than the stars. Blessing will come from you and from your line. That promise remains to those people as they're in Egypt. Eventually, Joseph is forgotten. The Pharaoh in charge sees these people and thinks they're probably no good, and so they end up being enslaved to the Egyptians for 400 years in slavery with this promise. You're my people. I've chosen you. I will call you and I'll provide a land for you. Even as God answers that promise, even when the time comes, how will they respond? Will they believe and go forth in faith? Or will they doubt and question and grumble? We follow the story of the Israelites. We hear of Moses, and God says to Moses, you're going to be used to set the people free. And so Moses hesitates. His path has been windy itself, hasn't been straightforward to what he has been called to do. But Moses goes and he says to Pharaoh, hey, I need you to let these slaves of yours go. God's made a promise to us as a people. We need to go and worship. You need to just let them go. And how does Pharaoh respond? Does he say, yeah, have at it. Take an extended vacation. That will be great for you all. Not so much. Pharaoh responds, there's no way. You are not taking these people. You are not taking my workforce. You are not taking my slaves. You're not going. How do the Israelites respond? When Moses goes to Pharaoh, how do they respond to this promise that is about to happen? Well, this comes from Exodus chapter 5, starting in verse 19. The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told, you are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day. You see, Pharaoh said, you're not taking them. Not only that, I'm making their work harder. And so the Israelites' overseers realized that and reacted to it. And when they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, may the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. The Israelites, when they heard that God was going to deliver them, their initial response was, it doesn't seem like it. Our work just got harder. Our burden got heavier. The path before us got more windy than it was already. They doubted the promise. They doubted the path. They doubted the provision of God. And as we follow their story, we know what happened. The plagues and the deliverance. Through Moses, God did miraculous works, and the people were set free. And they were set free in a way that was astounding. Flies and gnats and frogs and water turned to blood and all of this crazy stuff. And then they're set free, and on their way out, the Egyptians are like, here, take my gold with you. Here, take my silver with you. Here, take my riches with you. They plundered Egypt as they were leaving by the people just giving it to them. And so you would think, okay. They had their initial doubt. They were asked to do some things that are difficult, but now they've been freed. Surely now they'll trust the promise of God. Not to be the case. If we fast forward just a little bit, still staying in Exodus, we see that as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. God had freed them. God had provided. God had made a way for them out of their slavery in a miraculous fashion. And as soon as they get out, they look back and see the Egyptians coming and say, "We told you, Moses. We would have been better off there. We told you we should have never left. Life was better under slavery than it is here, being killed by these Egyptians, stuck by the Red Sea." They continued to doubt the promise, the path, the provision of God. The story continues. We know how history unfolded. At the Red Sea, God used Moses, and the Red Sea was parted. The waters were split. A cloud separated the Israelites from the Egyptians. They walked through in mass on dry land. Where there used to be water, there was now ground. They walked through the path that God had opened up for them. They made it to the other side. The Egyptians started to walk through that same path, and the waters came over them. God provided again in a miraculous way, freed from their captors, freed from their oppressors, freed from their past and their slavery. Surely now they would trust in God. I mean, water doesn't split like that all the time. I've been to the ocean, I've been to the seas. I can't make it go like that and walk through. Surely after seeing the hand of God, they would trust in him. But we see that's not the case. Further along in the story, we hear this in Exodus 15. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" 400 years or so of slavery under the Egyptians, freedom from them with plagues and miraculous deliverance, freedom from them through the parting of the Red Sea, and 3 days later, they're thirsty, they find water, and it's bitter. And instead of saying, "Hey, God, there's another problem before us, we trust you to solve it," no, they grumbled and they complained. And they said, "What are we going to drink? This water's bitter. How are we going to survive?" They doubted, again, the promise and the path and the provision of God. Once again, God provided. He told Moses to throw this thing into the water, and the water became fresh in a miraculous way once more. The water was treated. They had this source of water that they could drink from. Life should be good, right? They've escaped Egypt, their enemies. They've come to the desert. They've been provided water. Surely now they'll trust God's path. Nah, not so much. We go further yet, and we hear this. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." I want us to pause there for just a moment, back around the pots of meat. Remember who these Egyptians were and what they had come from. Slaves under slavery in Egypt. They weren't sitting at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Pots of meat were not before them. They were not doing well. In fact, they were crying out to God, saying, "God, would you deliver us?" And then God delivers them, and they get to this spot, and they say, "Oh, back there, man, slavery was awesome. We had all the food that we could eat." Their memory of what was before was not right. They didn't like their present moment, and they were glorifying their past. That was not correct. They did not have pots of meat and wonderful food to eat. They were oppressed. They got the scraps off of the Egyptians' table. Whatever crumbs they were offered, that was what they were stuck with. And yet when they are in the desert, they look back at their past and say, "Wow, slavery was pretty good." And then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. God once again says, I'll provide. I'll provide. You needed a way out of Egypt, I provided. You needed a way through the sea, I provided. You needed water in the desert that wasn't bitter, and I provided. You need food, and I'll provide. Bread from heaven. It will be there every day, and enough for you for that day. And on the 6th day, I'll give you extra so that on Sundays you can rest, and you can worship, and you can learn what it means to be a free people. God was providing for them. I want us to return for just a moment to our Pizza Palace imaginary game for just a minute here, our exercise. Now let's imagine we're anticipating the pizza and we're looking forward to this promised land, and we're driving around, and after a while we say to our host, I'm getting kind of hungry. This has been longer than I anticipated. I skipped breakfast this morning. I'm wanting some lunch, and we're mid-afternoon. I'm dwindling away to nothing here, to borrow a phrase from Boyd. A few of you have heard that before. But you start to complain about the hunger in your stomach, and your driver says, well, pop open the glove box for me. Just open it up. Fresh baked bread. Maybe even from Panera if we need a P in there. I didn't think of that one either. Somebody else told me that too. But fresh baked bread. The most delicious kind that you could want. Butter in the cup holder, the whole deal. And your driver's like, here, I know we're not there yet. I know you're hungry, but I have what you need. I have what you need. And every time you need it, it will be there for as long as we're on this journey. You still want the pizza. You're still looking forward to the promise ahead, but you've been provided for on the journey, on the path, on the way. Now you might think, okay, surely, please, Israelites, please let that be enough. Surely that's enough. Plagues, deliverance, plunder, provision through the water turning into fresh bread from heaven that you can bake and boil and do all kinds of things with. Surely that is enough to help you trust the plan, the promise, the provision of God. But no. Once more, they doubted. They doubted the things that God had in store. Once more, they grumbled and complained. If we move forward to Numbers, we hear this. The rabble with them began to crave other food, and again the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Now, their idea of no cost and my idea of no cost is way different. If I'm in slavery and I get a little clove of garlic thrown at me, I know that cost me everything to get that food. But they were glamorizing that past, looking at the thing that they had been delivered from and saying, it was awesome there. We eat fish and cucumbers and leeks and onions and garlic, but now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. Manna, we remember, just means kind of, well, what is it? It's bread from heaven. All we see is that. All we eat is that. All we get is that. And they complained. And they grumbled. And they doubted the promise and the path and the provision of God. And once again, God provides. God provides once again in a way that's miraculous, in a way that's incredible. He says, all right, you want meat? I'll give you more meat than you can imagine. Quail every evening to feed every person. So much quail that you'll get sick of eating the quail. Surely then, But no, the story continues. The people continue to go against God, against Moses as God's leader. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord only spoken through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. He heard them doubt. He heard their lack of faith. He heard their grumbling. He heard their complaining as they continued to doubt his way, his will, his path, his provision. And God leads them through the wilderness. It takes longer than maybe you would do on MapQuest or following ways. He takes a little longer route, but part of the reason why he takes that longer route is he understands they're not lost in a physical way. They're lost in a spiritual way. They have no idea how to walk in freedom. They have no idea how to follow the commandments of God. They have no idea on how to be the people that God has called them to be. And so he leads them through this wilderness where he gives them some boundaries and the Ten Commandments and the law, and he shows them what it means to trust in him and to worship him. And he leads them all the way to the promised land, all the way right up to the promised land. And as we're in our little imagination, in our own imaginary journey, we get to the land, and it's not just us. We've reached Pizza Palace, and we see it before us, but it's not just us that have gone. We have a whole group of people with us, and so we're like, okay, you guys go scope it out. We'll send a representation of our group up to Pizza Palace. Go check it out, see how it is. And they go up, and it's glorious, wonderful buffet. They got that Chicago-style deep dish stuff. They got the New York pie, the real thin stuff. They got Latrobe style, like sweet crust and all. They have Detroit style. They have Columbus style. They have pizza slices that are bigger than your head. They have dessert pizza for when you're too full to eat anything more, but you can shove some more of that in because there's always room for dessert pizza. They have every kind of pizza you can imagine. They send some people out, scope out the land, see how it is. And they do. If we look in Numbers, chapter 13, the Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, from which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. And then moving on to verse 17, when Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev and onto the hill country. See what the land is like and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring some of the fruit of the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob towards Lebo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron with Amihan, Seshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. Have you been to one of those pizza places or restaurants in general where you can't quite read all of the names? Your pronunciation's a little off in what they're offering you. That's kind of this deal, for me anyway. The descendants of Anak lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch, bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off from there. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. Pizza Palace is here, friends, and it's wonderful. There are grapes that the clusters of which it take 2 people to carry. Pomegranates and figs, all kind of things that you cannot imagine. And you would think that at this point the Israelites would say, yeah, we've made it. But our little contingency that we sent comes back and says something different. It's awesome. Lots of pizza. Well, as much as you can eat. But we're not going. Like, what? We're not going? I'm so hungry. This is the promise that I've been waiting for. Why aren't we going? The line's too long. There's a couple guys up front. They look a little rough. They might eat it all. The price, a little too high. It's too costly to get in. We're not going. Let's head back. Back to where we were before. Back to the life we lived before. Back before we ever went on this journey towards our promise. And that's what the Israelites did. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite company at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea along the Jordan. It's awesome food. Tough crowd. Caleb stood out, and he silenced the people before Moses and said, "No, we should go up and take possession of this land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack these people. They're stronger than we are." They spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them." That night, all of the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole assembly said to them, "If we had only died in Egypt or in the wilderness was better than going there. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader to go back to Egypt." The people had been following this path. They'd been grumbling all along the way. And they finally reached the promise. And God says, you can step right on into it. I have given this to you. But they doubted the promise. They doubted God to direct the path. They doubted God to continue to provide. In fact, they doubted God. That he would take care of them. That he would be sufficient. They doubted God, who had delivered them from slavery and oppression, who had walked them through a sea on dry ground, who had turned water that was bitter into a fresh stream, who provided bread from heaven 6 days of the week and double on the sixth so that on the seventh they might rest. They doubted the God that had taken care of their previous enemies, and with the fruit of the land before them, they continued to doubt and said, we want to return. We want to return back to that life we lived before, to our sin, to our slavery, to the oppression that was before us. Friends, our journey in life includes deserts and wilderness, wandering. It includes difficult and hard places. That's part of living life. And when we enter into seasons of wandering where it seems like a dark and dry and weary land where there is no water, we might ask ourselves, why am I here? What am I doing here? How did I get here, and how do I get out? For the Israelites, there were a couple of options when they were asked that question. When they were asking, well, why are we in the wilderness? There were really two choices, basically. One, they were following God. Two, they were not following God. You see, back at the start of this journey, it was God's plan for them to walk through the wilderness. Being faithful to God meant wandering in the wilderness, walking through the wilderness, following God. At one point of their journey, that was the answer to that question. In fact, if you look in Exodus again, we can see this verse. And this is chapter 13, verse 17 and 18. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Faithfulness to God meant a path to the wilderness that was longer than they might have hoped. It meant turning right when they might have thought they should turn left and go the short way. And so if we find ourselves wandering in the wilderness, that might be a question that we ask, well, why am I here? And if the answer is, well, we've been faithful as far as we can be, then we continue on in that faith. But then if we fast forward to where we just were a minute ago, if that makes sense, but if we looked, when they're asked to step into the promised land, they say, no. We want to go back to Egypt. Do you know what happened after that? God said, well, all right. You don't want to go in, I won't make you go in. You're not going back to Egypt, but 40 years you can wander around in the desert. 40 years of wilderness. So one case, they were in the wilderness when they were following God. Another case, they were in the wilderness when they were not, when they were being disobedient, where they hadn't done the things that God had asked for them to do, when they had not stepped into that promise that God had given them. And so we ask ourselves, well, why am I here? Have I been faithful? Have I been unfaithful? And then we respond in faith either way. Okay, I've been faithful. I'll continue to follow God wherever you lead. I'll continue to follow this path you have for me, even though I don't understand it. I don't think we're headed in the direction I thought we would be. Even though it makes no sense to me, I'll continue to follow you in faith because that's all I know to do. Or if we had gotten there the other way, we say, okay, God, I have not been faithful, but I want to be now. I want to turn from that stuff and follow you now. So when we're wandering in the wilderness, why are we there? Following God, not following God? We respond in faith. And then the next thing that we need to do as we journey along, as we watch, our heart and our mouth. The Bible teaches that the mouth kind of shares what goes on in the heart. That the stuff that comes out of here is a reflection of what goes on in here, and God is concerned about what goes on in here. And so if we find ourselves always grumbling about where God has put us, always complaining about the way that God has worked out things in our lives, always looking at the bad situation that we're in, finding ourselves like the Israelites, it's a reflection of our heart. And we need to be mindful of that. Trust that God will lead. Trust that God will provide. We can say to God in faith, I don't get it. I don't understand why I'm here right now. I don't get your plan, but trust in you. And that's our response. We walk in faith and we trust God. We walk in faith and we trust God. And we ask God to work on our heart, to work on our mouth, to work on the ways that we live. And we don't look back to Egypt and say that way was better. And as we're on this journey, we can't forget to eat. We can't forget to eat. See, Jesus says in the Gospel of John, he says this in verse 51 of John chapter 6. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Jesus references that manna that sustained, that provided for, that offered all that the Israelites needed. He says, I'm the real bread that came from heaven. I am all that you need. All that you need. If you're in a wilderness, if you're in the season of plenty, if you're in the time of hardship, and if you're in a time of great blessing, that we don't forget that Jesus is all that we need, that we don't forget that we eat that bread of life, knowing that he sustains us, that he strengthens us, that it's by his Spirit that we are healed, that we are able to be obedient, to follow after him, that we don't forget to eat. Friends, we wish to be people who learn from the story of God and the people that have followed after God and those who have done well and those who have failed. We wish to be people who will trust God, that we trust the promises of God, that we trust the path that God leads us down, and that we trust that God will provide. That no matter where God leads, that we will trust in him, and that he will provide all we need. Jesus has made some promises to us. He's promised to never leave us, to never forsake us. He's promised here just in the scripture this morning that he's that living bread from heaven, source of life. He's promised to free us from sin, from slavery to it, from the life that we used to live. And as we walk into that promise, I pray that we don't look back and say, man, Egypt is looking pretty good. I liked it when I was my own God, when I followed after my own ways, when I ate whatever I wanted and did whatever I wanted, however I wanted. That's a false picture of what the past actually looks like. We were freed from our sin, freed from our suffering, freed from our shame, and that is the promise of Christ. May we continue to walk in that freedom, trusting the path that God has for us, trusting that he will provide and that he is our way. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your word. Your word also promises us that it will not return to you void, that you accomplish those things that you wish to accomplish. And so we wish to be responsive to you and to your word, that you might accomplish what you want to do in our own lives. If we're still in our sin and our shame and our suffering, if we're still trapped in Egypt, oppressed, even if we don't know it, but we're there, Lord, we ask that your word would speak to our hearts and that you would free us from that. And then, Lord, if we're wandering in the wilderness and we're grumbling and complaining and we think that life was better before, or we just don't trust you, we ask that your word would encourage us and strengthen us, that by your Spirit we would come to understand your heart, that you are trustworthy, that your word is true, that your path is the best for us. Help us respond to you in faith. Fill us with your Spirit to make us more like you, Jesus. And help us to trust that you are all that we need. We pray and ask all this in your name. Amen.